To have served in this office is to have felt a very personal sense of kinship.
Well, I had no idea of how skillful or spectacular the special effects were going to be.
Elvis Presley died today. He was 42. Apparently it was a heart attack.
I'm told that to be in the height of trendy fashion these days, you've got to wear shoes like these.
We have liftoff at 2:13.
A big part of art and entertainment in the 70s was a sudden interest in film. Ever since the 50s, TV became a large part of people's lives, and soon, TV overcame films in popularity. The 70s was when special effects came in and started the blockbuster films. Movies such as Star Wars, Jaws, The Godfather, Carrie, and The Exorcist were some of the films that are now called classics. There's a saying that says, "They don't make movies like the 70s," which can be true since some of the most famous and classic movies were made in that time period. Movies like Star Wars, which made $775,398,007 worldwide and was ranked number 6 best all-time movies by box office. And the 1975 horror movie Jaws, which topped The Godfather in just 78 days of release and ended up with $133.4 million. These films had big impacts on society, like the 1977 movie Saturday Night Fever, which basically changed the U.S. overnight. Though the world was still concerned with world peace, a large trend was coming up thanks to the movie Saturday Night Fever. Saturday Night Fever had popularized disco music and clothing. Though the age of disco ended as quickly as it came, it still made a large impression while it lasted. It became a huge mainstream trend. Clothes such as flamboyant patterns and glitzy jumpsuits and large gold chains became very popular, and bands like the Bee Gees and Earth, Wind & Fire ruled over popular music. This point in the 70s was very large and important because it had caused such a tremendous outbreak in new trends. Another important part of the 70s was the TV show All in the Family. Before the reign of movies started, the 1971 show All in the Family broke all the rules for television. Issues such as sexuality, race relations, feminism, and abortion were discussed openly on the show.
And if he sees a cross burning there, he might get the wrong idea of what the cross really means.
At first, people didn't know how to react to the show, and it was almost cancelled, but by the summer of 1971, it gained large popularity and remained its #1 spot for 5 seasons. All in the Family altered other popular shows and made way for others concerning certain issues. All in the Family had basically changed television forever. Elvis Presley's death was one of the most impacting things in the 70s. Elvis Presley, or otherwise known as the King, died on August 16, 1977 due to a heart attack. Elvis was one of the most popular artists at the time, singing a new type of genre people called rockabilly. The term was developed in the 50s. Ever since Elvis died at the age of 42, his home in Graceland became a memorial for him, and heartbroken fans all over the world paid their respects. Elvis had a big impact on music and dancing because of what people considered sexual movements on stage. Elvis was also in 33 movies in his lifetime and created over 800 songs. Elvis was spotted #1 many times for his songs and is known as the King of Pop to this day.
If I can't help falling in love with you.
We'll see the work of the 70s in our everyday lives. ESPN, or Entertainment and Sports Programming, was launched on September 7, 1979, in Connecticut. ESPN is a channel that broadcasts sports games every day. ESPN was created by Bill Rasmussen and his son Scott. After Bill was fired from being a manager for the New England Whalers in 1978, he met Ed Egan, and Bill proposed the idea of creating a show. Though there were many financial difficulties, ESPN was incorporated on July 14, 1978. To this day, ESPN is one of the most popular shows, still broadcasting sports games 24/7.
First, we start off with the Apollo 13 project and how that affected America. You may have seen the Tom Hanks movie Apollo 13, but the actual event made America free still for 5 days. The story was about the Apollo 13 crew, which consisted of Jack Swigert, Ken Mattingly, and Jim Lovell. And when the spaceship launched on April 11, 1970 into the atmosphere, but while up there, most of the machines malfunctioned and they were stuck in space for almost a week, but they all made it down safely to Earth. The next is in computer technology in the world's first microprocessor, and that was created in 1971. It was released in November of that year and was made by the company you may know as today as Intel. The name of it was the Intel 404 microprocessor. Even though you may think it might be useless, it has led to our calculator, which most of you probably used on your recent midterms. Our next big technology discovery was the first computer floppy disk. It was created by the engineering team of IBM. The man who led the engineering team was Alan Shugart. The first disk could hold about 80 to 100 kilobytes, which isn't a lot of data for a computer today, considering your average iPhone has about 8 gigabytes of data. The disk was 8 inches long, and a regular iPhone 5 is about 5 inches. So when you compare that to today, it is a great advance in technology. If you saw the Jobs movie, you may recognize the next part. In 1976, the company you may know today as Apple was created by Steve Jobs and his partner Wozniak. The first computer had 8 kilobytes of data, which made it a little more powerful than the other computers of its time. It ran on a Motorola processor. Yet some of the computer hobbyists didn't take Jobs so seriously at the first convention he was at, and they didn't think his Apple I was that great. So, Wozniak engineered a disk drive that allowed small computers to read and store large amounts of data. Finally, in 1979, there was the oil crisis. The OAPEC, which stands for Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, put an embargo on all the oil, therefore raising the prices of the oil greatly. This resulted in a shortage in all of the developed countries, therefore leading America to have to research more in the technology of self-sufficient cars.
The first event is the Watergate scandal, which happened in June of 1972. In that year, President Richard M. Nixon was running for his re-election. On the night of the 17th of June, several men were arrested when attempting to break into the offices of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate building in Washington, D.C. They are trying to embed listening devices in phones and steal secret documents. The subsequent investigation traced the burglars to Nixon. Instead of being impeached for this, he resigned, and his successor, Gerald Ford, pardoned him for any crimes that he may or may not have actually committed.
A step toward our ultimate goal, the elimination of all nuclear weapons.
The second event would be the nuclear limitation treaties that were signed with the Soviet Union. Starting in the late 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union both had arsenals that could destroy the world many times over. So, to prevent any conflict, the United States and the Soviet Union began meetings in Helsinki to try and limit the growth of nuclear arsenals. The main topics of these treaties, called the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT, was the limitation of anti-ballistic missiles and intercontinental ballistic missiles, also known as ABMs and ICBMs. They continued into the late 1970s, until almost ended by President Jimmy Carter after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. But the later president, Ronald Reagan, brought back the treaty to prevent any tensions with the USSR in the early 1980s. Since then, both countries have not overstepped the treaty. The third event is the crisis of the Munich Olympics in 1972. The Olympics had been to Germany before, in the late 1930s under Adolf Hitler. So, naturally, The West German government was eager to show that they were not like the evil empire that had preceded them. But on September 5th, several armed terrorists infiltrated the Olympic Village and entered the building that the Israeli athletes were staying in. After a brief fight, 2 Israelis were killed and the remaining 9 taken hostage. These terrorists, who revealed themselves as Palestinians, demanded the release of over 200 prisoners which were incarcerated in Palestine and West Germany, including several terrorist leaders, and a plane that would take them to Cairo, Egypt. After many hours of negotiation, the terrorists were flown to the nearest NATO base and were prepping to board an airliner that would take them to Cairo with the prisoners. But the West German police forces had planned an ambush, and instead of it working, there were many more terrorists than expected. This, combined with poor equipment and limited conversations, led to the ambush being botched and a near 2-hour firefight. When the smoke cleared, 1 West German, all 5 of the terrorists, and all 9 Israelis were killed.
I have asked for this radio and television time tonight for the purpose of announcing that we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam.
The next event is the end of the Vietnam War. Since the early 1960s, American troops have been involved in Vietnam, aiding in the civil war between the Republican South and the Communist North. Though peace talks had concluded in 1973 with a ceasefire, U.S. troops were still pulling out in 1975. In May of that year, the last of the United States troops withdrew from the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon, ending a war that lasted nearly a decade and killed nearly 60,000 Americans. The day after, the Communist Northern Vietnamese Army marched into Saigon, uniting the 2 countries. The last event is the Iranian hostage crisis of 1979. In the 1970s, the Iranian people began to chafe under the rule of Shah Reza Mohammad Pahlavi. Iran had become rich with oil money, but all that money had mainly gone to the upper class, causing a disparity of money to all the classes. In 1978, the Iranian people revolted and toppled the Shah's regime, and would replace him with former religious leader Ayatollah Khomeini. The Shah would flee Iran in January of 1979. In November of that year, a mob of violent protesters would storm the United States Embassy in Tehran. Out of 90 occupants, 66 people were taken hostage. They were held for over a year before being released in 1980, just minutes after the new president, Ronald Reagan, was inaugurated.
On the east side of Chicago, back in the USA, back in the bad old days, in the heat of a summer night, in the land of the dollar bill, when the town of Chicago died, they talk about it still. When a man named Al Capone tried to make that town his own, and he called his gangs to war with the forces of the law.